Keep Our NHS Public and Keep Our NHS Public North East has been around since about 2008. There have been many campaigns prior to that, campaigning to keep our NHS properly funded, publicly provided and based on need. It feels to me as if we're really at the point at which we have to now stand firm and speak out strongly and push our politicians to remember those things, and that's obviously what our speaker, Allyson Pollock, will talk about much more eruditely than I will. Keep Our NHS Public North East tends to cover Newcastle and Gateshead. There are now groups in South Tyneside, in Sunderland. There are now campaigns in Northumberland and Hexham. I'm sure many of you will be aware of the groups across the country, and particularly other campaigns such as NHS 999 and the Darlow Mums who did the Jarrow March a couple of years ago. Our aims are simply to keep a properly funded, publicly provided NHS which gives services to people based on need. That's what we need, that's what we want, and we think that's still what most people in this country want, that those are being eroded. We try and work through public meetings like this. We have a website, and we've put some of the details on your seats, Facebook page and Twitter address these days. There are many things that are happening, that happen through the campaigns ran through the election, but particularly this week, which is the birthday, it's the 69th birthday of the NHS on Wednesday. And we'll come back at the end to talk about the things that we'll be doing on Wednesday to recognise that. This meeting is scheduled to finish around 8:30, certainly by 8:45. You're all cordially invited to come across to the union rooms for a drink afterwards if you wish to continue the conversations and the questions. It is a lecture. Alison's actually going to ask you at the beginning for some questions so that she knows she's covered the right things. She will then go into a presentation and then we will take questions and answers. There is a video being made of this evening that will be freely available on the Keep Our NHS Public North East page. Again, if anybody has a problem with being filmed, can you please let us know, and if you can tell John at the back there. It will generally actually be of Allyson and her presentation, but if you're unhappy then please let us know. So, it's my joy to introduce Professor Allyson Pollock. Allyson has been a strong campaigner on behalf of the NHS for many, many, many years. A strong and effective campaigner. And I know I've been in many meetings, particularly with doctors who like to tell you how you've got it wrong, where she's always got the right answer for whatever nonsense they've But what is delightful now is that Allyson is now the director of the Institute of Health and Society here at Newcastle University, and that's a total delight. Her official website says she's set up and directed research and teaching units previously at Queen Mary's, University of London, but also more recently in Edinburgh. And she's managed to establish some of the UK's leading undergraduate and postgraduate teaching in global health. Prior to that, she was at UCL in London, a very, very experienced campaigner. I'm sure many of you, like me, became fully aware of what was happening about privatisation when we read Alyson's book, NHS PLC, which was well over 13, 14 years ago now. And everything that was in that book is exactly what's happening. So I'd like to invite Allyson to talk to us about what's happening and how she feels what we should be doing and how we should be campaigning post the last election to make sure that we ensure that the NHS continues. Allyson Pollock.
Thank you. There are lots of seats at the front, so please do come down. Well, thank you very much for that lovely warm welcome. Can you all hear me? Because I'm not wearing a mic, so if you can't, put your hands up. So thank you for the lovely warm welcome, and indeed I have to say I've had a very warm welcome since coming to Newcastle in January, and I feel very much at home. So thank you to everybody here, and lovely to see members of the Institute here as well. In fact, I see more of them here than however, the tectonic plates are shifting. They've shifted enormously. And looking around this room, I thought, there's one woman in this room. She's up there. What did it take to do that? So I've got quite a lot of ground I'm going to try and cover, but before I do, I thought I wanted to make sure I get this right and understand why you're here. And I should declare two conflicts of interest. One is I'm on the council of the British Medical Association, and the other is I'm one of the founding members, as you said, of the National Keep Our NHS Public campaign. And my memory is so bad, I think that goes back to 2004 or 5 or something, when we were predicting all that has come to pass. So, can I take any questions? Why are you here? What do you want us to talk about?
Before we war start to finish now, because the STPs were announced and the funding cuts were put in there, but it didn't say exactly what that meant. Now we're starting to come up with actual proposals for changes. Yeah. And what they're saying is that it's not driven by money, it's driven by wanting to improve the service, and that to have centres of excellence where they want to concentrate services, you need a throughput of patients to keep that centre of excellence up to standard, that the specialists there need that throughput to keep verifying their practicing skills. If you don't have that, you won't attract specialists to that centre. But as a layperson, so that sounds very reasonable. How would you counter that? We need to have medical experience. We need medical people to examine these.
So, are the proposals under the STPs that are here, and it's £26 billion worth of cuts, justified, which is all about shifting care closer to your home, inside your home? So, okay, any other questions? Why are you here?
Can I ask you, are there factions in the medical profession who are supporting the plans? And if so, why are they supporting?
Okay. Well, BMA policy is opposed to STPs. It passed a big motion at the ARM. And it is in support of the reinstatement of our NHS. And its policy is to support the NHS Bill, which we hope will go into Parliament. More on that later. So the BMA is against foundation cuts, it's against marketisation, it's against charging, and it's pro-NHS. So don't let anybody else tell you anything else. Okay.
I would very much like to know what can be done about the 2012 Health and Social Plan, and whether there are elements of it, particularly the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Health, that can be modified without wholesale.
Without primary legislation? No. There aren't, but we'll come to that. Yeah. So what can be done?
Yeah, I was at a meeting 2 days ago with clinicians who were saying that there are now models of care where small hospitals can keep care in the communities. But of course, the big agenda is to try and smash up all of the small hospitals.
You have to speak up to the audience.
The present agenda is to smash up all of the small hospitals,
okay.
But these acute models of care are actually operating within this region, whereby they can work in collaboration but keep acute services at the smaller hospitals.
Okay.
And that would be very useful in terms of fighting the campaigns to defend our hospital.
The small hospital closures that have been proposed, which have been going on for 40, 50 years. Okay. Yeah.
I'm interested in questions of power and governance in the NHS, particularly at the local level, and most specifically, I'm toying with the question of whether governors, I'm not a governor myself, whether governors on NHS trusts have any point.
Maybe the rest of the audience can answer that question.
Yeah, can you touch on the Naylor review, please, and where we're going with property?
Okay, Project Phoenix is the Naylor review and PFI, return to PFI. Yeah.
One of the latest things, teams around practices, it's now called teams around patients. On behalf of Durham keep our NHS public, which unfortunately didn't get a mention at the start. Durham is always forgotten. I've been in correspondence with our local council and just received a reply today from one of the cabinet members claiming that they will bring care closer to patients, which is what people want, etc., etc., and also accountable care networks.
Accountable care organisations.
We've got this strange urgent care hospital, that's what it's called, at Cramlington, which means that ambulances have to drive past the door of Hudson General and such like, and not go in there. What's the rationale for that? Is there any evidence that it can work, and is it working?
I don't know. I can't answer that question.
As a Labour Party member and socialist, I've been quite disappointed by the policies and responses to what's happening, and particularly the lack of support for the NHS reinstatement bill. I'm wondering if there's any initiative to try and get some of the new intake of Labour MPs to sign up to that, and if so,
I can answer that now. Yes, unfortunately, the reinstatement of the NHS is not in the Labour Party manifesto. It's a very modest manifesto demand. But this week, last week, there was a ballot private members bill, and we're asking everybody to email the Labour MPs in the first top 10 of that ballot to take that bill, the bill forward. The NHS Bill is a response to the Health and Social Care Act, which actually is a privatising and dismantling Act of Parliament. It basically abolishes the Act, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the NHS Bill was written as a result, actually, of Lord Owen, who was a great defender of the NHS as it passed through the House of Lords. And he came to me, and he came to Peter Roderick, the barrister, and he asked us if we would draft a bill to reinstate the NHS. So we spent the next, between 2012 and 2015 actually, drafting a bill, consulting on it, redrafting it, and adding new clauses. And it's now been in the House of Lords twice, I think, and the House of Commons 3 times. And we are not going to go away. It's going to be a bit like the abolition of slavery bill. It took 60 years for the abolition of slavery bills to be passed, but we're hoping it'll be sooner than that. And so really, I think this is part of the big purpose of you being here today. It's my one big ask. The message is that you really get behind the NHS bill. It is a solution because it will reinstate the NHS in England. And if you don't have it, we will have lost it. And I think it's really important to get the Labour Party on board for this. We want a cross-party bill, not just Labour. We'd like Lib Dem. We've got the SNP on board. We'd like the Welsh, obviously. The Green Party, Caroline Lucas took it forward the first time in the Commons. And so this is a really key time, and it's really part of the big purpose I see for us being here today. So I'll start off really. I'll try and come to these questions. We could just have question and answer. I realise I should have had a panel really, because many of you in this audience are better at replying than I am responding. But could I have this slide on? Where to begin? Well, the break-up and dismantling of the NHS didn't happen overnight. As many of you know, the story really starts in the 1980s. Until then, there was largely a political consensus around the NHS, including massive constraints on expenditure. Because for its first 40 years, the NHS really expenditure never got above 4.5% of GDP. So that's one of the first myths, is the myth of unaffordability. The NHS was put into place post-war at a time when the country was absolutely broke. And really for the first 40 or 50 years, it never really got above 6% of GDP. So it's a completely affordable system, and it became the model maker for the rest of the world. So, and of course, the NHS is the most beloved of all the institutions post the Beveridge report. And indeed it remains so today. Of all the Labour voters, people voting Labour, NHS was top of the priority list, so that was for 40% of the electorate. The NHS was the top issue. So I think that's very important to remember. And so the consensus on the NHS didn't really start to break down, as you know, until Mrs. Thatcher came to power. And in the 1980s, I managed to turn it off. In the 1980s, we first had the Griffiths report. He was the supermarket guru that Thatcher brought in. And he first said, well, what's wrong with the NHS? It's badly managed, and we need doctors as managers, and we need a new technical managerial tier, because formerly we had administrators, hospital administrators, health service administrators, so we had the big management reforms. But the real big bang came, of course, with Kenneth Clarke in 1989, 1990. Many of you will remember the BMA campaign, What Do You Call a Man Who Doesn't Listen? Kenneth Clarke. And that was a huge struggle because that brought in the NHS and Community Care Act, and it brought in the internal market. So all the structures for a quasi-shadow market. It broke up the NHS into trusts, corporate bodies, providers and purchasers, the great purchaser-provider split, with billing and pricing. But of course this was all shadow, there was no commercial contracting at that point. And that brought with it a huge tier of management costs. So the administration of the NHS had been very, very low, 5% of the total budget on all the management. But overnight it doubled, because every hospital had to have their own HR department, their own press department, and billing and invoicing and all the rest of it. But we had the internal market, and at that time also, what people didn't realise is that they also brought in the mechanism where for the first time ever, hospitals and community services were responsible for their own capital. And that was called the capital charging regime. So for the first time ever, they had to find out of the income that paid for patient care, some income would now go to pay for their capital charge. And that initially was internal to the NHS and the Treasury. But that then became the forerunner of something called the Private Finance Initiative. And I'm guessing you've all heard of PFI, where all the land and buildings are sold off, and instead the government enters into 60-year, 30-year or 60-year contracts with private contractors. So the 1990s was a very turbulent period. And contrary to all expectations, when New Labour came to power in 1997, they did not move away from the internal market. They moved away from GP fund holding, but they carried on with it, and their very first act was the PFI Act. And not a single PFI contract had been signed until New Labour came to power. So that's very, very important. And of course what we've had is enormous indebtedness. So all across the country, still to this day, hospitals and community trusts are saddled with enormous debts because they're still paying private finance as a form of debt. It's a sale and leaseback arrangement. You sell off your buildings and your assets, and you're leasing it back from big multinational corporations at exorbitant interest rates. So today the interest rate is what, 0.5%? We know the senior debt, we're paying 6 to 8%, and on the subordinated debt, the other bit, we're paying around 15% of interest. And then we've got enormous returns on equity. Now that is the first, so not only do we have huge administration costs, but we also have the very, very expensive costs of servicing PFI debts. And that is the money that's now been bailing out the banks and propping up the banks, but it's money that's been diverted out of services. And this is one of the reasons why hospitals and trusts are struggling. More than 2/3 of them are in serious financial deficit. really bad financial difficulties, and that's because of PFI. So it's all very well, the government and Labour saying, lift the public sector pay cap. But you can't lift the 1% cap if you don't have more money coming in, and if you don't address the enormous efficiencies in the system which are coming as a result of the market and PFI. So this period, the 1990s, which was both a Conservative and Labour period, so the Conservative designed the policies and Labour implemented them. Then we had, of course, Frank Dobson was quite a good Secretary of State. He did his best. He had the National Bed Inquiry. He realised the bed closures were going far too far. And then that was followed swiftly by Alan Milburn, who I believe you'll all know here. He's a man of your people. He's your... he came in with the NHS plan, but the NHS plan is a plan for privatisation. And it really heralded a number of things. And the first big thing, of course, was the privatisation of elective care, the easy bits. So the government took off £4 billion, and the idea was that you would have your choice of provider, and that was all the elective surgery, hips and hearts, and you could go out, and that would go out and be contracted out and go out to tender. Well, Graham's in the audience here has done a lot of work on ISDTs, and we analysed some of the contracts, one in Scotland with a big South African company, and showed what poor value for money they were. And they had a number of knock-on effects, because if you take out the elective surgery, you leave the more difficult, the rump patients behind, etc., etc. So you have the private sector doing risk selection basically going on. They were picking the treatments and the patients they wanted, leaving the difficult hard ones behind so that the junior doctors were not being trained. And that was a very, very expensive experiment that is still going out today and unfortunately being rolled out even further. Then in phase 4, we had the Health and Social Care Community Standards Act, and this was Milburn's baby. So trusts, NHS trusts, had a break-even duty. These are your hospitals like Newcastle, etc. And they were now given more and more powers, new entrepreneurial powers, so they could get into joint ventures with foreign investors, set up, and then above all, especially under the new Act, 2012, they were given powers to raise up to half of their income privately. So they were given a cap originally on how much private income they could make. That cap, a bit like higher education fees, was successively lifted. It was challenged in court by Unison, and Unison won that challenge against the previous government. And so they passed a bill in the Health and Social Care Act, which now sets up your foundation trusts as 49% private, really, structurally 49%. Now, what does that mean? That means that foundation trusts' primary purpose is no longer the care of patients. It's about income generation. And 49% of income can, in theory, be generated through private patients and private activities, including setting up private hospitals like King's in Dubai, or UCLH in, I can't remember, Abu Dhabi. You know, they're all setting up, going into joint ventures, looking for ways of creating and generating private income. And this also has implications for the foundation trust, because the more money you're generating from private patients, it means that your beds, your services and your staff are being redirected away from the NHS. And some hospitals, like in Manchester, but also the Maudsley, have got enormous, almost 40% of their income now is coming from private patients. And this is at a time when beds are closing and community services are closing and being slashed. So, this is a really important change that foundation trusts had. And of course, foundation trusts were given powers to sell off their building and their lands and to keep the profits. So phase 5 is really the dismantling phase. You can see that over a period, and this is how first Act of Parliament for the NHS in 1948 is tiny. And it's beautifully simple and beautifully elegant. And it put in place a National Health Service, and it's very readable and legible. You can understand it. The Health and Social Care Act, it took over 20 years to get to the Health and Social Care Act through incremental changes because the government never told us what the real purpose was. But in the final phase, the Health and Social Care Act 2012 is the Dismantling Act. It is the Act of Parliament that abolishes our NHS. And this is very difficult for people to understand because you've got your NHS Trust, you've got Newcastle Hospital, but what you RVI, but you've got to keep in your head the fact that the NHS has been abolished, but there's still £140 billion worth of NHS funds flowing into services. But the new Act, which is 457 pages long, 457 pages, is putting a new systems in place which are modelled on the American healthcare system. And the language of ACSs, accountable care services, and accountable care organisations come directly from the US. Those words were not in our lexicon, not in the NHS lexicon at all. And yet these words are directly imported from the US. So, this is phase 5, and the Health and Social Care Act does a number of things. It puts in place the elements for moving towards the American healthcare system. But it does something else. This is another very important act. The Health and Social Care Act also carved out public health, many children's services, also sexual health services, and it carved them out and gave them to local authorities. And that money is not even badged anymore as NHS funding, but local authority funding. So a whole swathe of services have now been lost from the NHS in a rerun of the 1980s and 90s when long-term care was carved out of the NHS. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So the Local Government Devolution Act 2016 is a really important act because it enabled the devolution. It gave local authorities far-ranging and far-reaching powers to actually run and operate health services. They've got health functions of their own. And in addition to that, the government gave the possibility to local authorities to make new regulations for charging. And we have a big paper coming out in the British Medical Journal in the next month or so that will set out some of the complexity of what I'm talking about here. So, the Health and Social Care Act was followed, of course, by the 5-year forward view, which sets out this thing called STPs, Sustainability and Transformation Plans. And, of course, these STPs now do something completely different. They move away, the Conservative government says that they're trying to bring back a sort of planning framework, and I'll shortly explain why that's not possible, but they divide the country into 44 geographic areas and footprints and say to the STPs, you now have to make £26 billion worth of saving over the next, I can't remember how many next years. And that's accompanied by enormous cuts and closures. So every STP footprint is accompanied by cuts and closures of hospitals, 18 A&E departments threatened, many local and community services all across the country. And the BMA has done quite a good job of summarising this, but as has John Lister and Sean Boyle. So we've got this, and then we've got the language of STPs transforming to ATOs and ACSs. So we've got the, sorry, I keep doing this. So in my talk, I am talking about England. Because interestingly enough, Scotland reversed the internal market post-devolution. And actually what it was doing was, and it did it with not a murmur. It passed an act of parliament and it reversed all the 1990 changes. And it did it by removing all the disruptive effects of the market. So the second thing that you're going to hear from people, not just about affordability, that's the first myth, we can't afford it. The second myth that you're going to hear is we don't want another reorganisation. We're exhausted by reorganisations. And we are, because we've had market or reorganisation after market reorganisation. But the thing to remember is that if we don't have a reorganisation, we're going to continue with the status quo of dismantling and privatisation. And the second thing to remember is that Scotland did it, removed all the disruptive elements of the market, but for the people working on the ground, they didn't notice a thing. Just that there was less administration, there were no contracting meetings, no commissioning meetings, you didn't have to go to tender, you didn't have to compete for tender, you didn't have rooms full of lawyers and management consultants. I've been there. I was UCLH when I saw the PFI going through in the commissioning process. So all of that is just gone. So as for disruption, that's the second myth that you can really challenge, and important to do so. So Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland still have integrated health services, and Scotland's gone even further, because it really is trying to integrate health and social care. And it's made personal care free at the point of delivery, but Scotland is being squeezed because of the Barnett formula and because the settlement for Scotland comes from the Treasury. So if the NHS is being squeezed in England, so is Scotland. Not one single hospital is a deficit, and I think that's really important to remember. It's a very different feeling because you have integrated health services. Now that's the other argument for STPs. The government will tell you it's all about integrating health and social care. How can you integrate health and social care when social care is means tested and charged for, and NHS care is free at the point of delivery? You can't. You can't do it. Which is why it works so well in Scotland, because personal care is free. And so even though you're moving between from the NHS to local authority providers, you don't feel it, because it's all being done through the case management system. So Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland still have commitment to all the principles, free at the point of delivery, universal, publicly funded, publicly founded, publicly accountable. But unfortunately, England abandoned universality. And by universality, I mean coverage. So the duty, and this is really important to remember, this is what's been lost. The duty to provide universal services, key universal services that was set out in the schedule, from mental health, learning disabilities, acute hospitals, maternity care, they were all set out in the schedule. That's been lost throughout England. That duty was there throughout England, and so it was delegated to area-based authorities. The second thing that happened is that because the duty to provide went, there was a duty to arrange for the persons for whom they're responsible for, i.e. not everybody living in the area anymore on CCGs, and that duty to arrange made commercial contracting virtually compulsory. And it's why nearly every area of the country, CCGs are going out to tender. Very, very expensive. So we doubled the transaction cost from 6% to 12% post-internal market. We know from the US that the costs of the market are around 33%. That's what administration costs are if you run a market. Because markets bring costs that the public sector doesn't have. No bidding, no invoicing, no advertising on buses, no big press departments. And this is a real problem, is the extent of commercial contracting, and the government has not replied truthfully in Hansard. It's saying it's only a very small percentage, but they've only looked at some of the contracting that's done by NHS England and CCGs. They haven't looked at the full scale of all the contracting that's happening, and we'll have to do an FOI. It also gave public services the powers to generate income. I told you about this. 49% now they're established as for the first time ever. And it's ended mandatory universal service obligation. And as I said earlier, it's carved out huge chunks of services which have now passed to local authorities. And that is a complete rerun of what was going on in the 1990s for long-term care, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So, once you've abandoned that duty to provide for everyone, and you've moved to a market, the most important thing to remember about a market system is the cherry picking and the cream skimming, is risk. How do you handle risk? And some of you in this audience will be driving a car and aged over 70, so you will know how your insurance companies handle your risk. Some of you are trying to go on holidays and you're aged over 70. So you know that insurers are all about risk selection and risk avoidance. And that is exactly what begins to happen. And if you set up our hospitals and our services so that they have to now make surpluses, no longer even concerned about breaking even, and they're always worried about the balance sheet, they're going to get into risk avoidance strategies. And that will lead to the denial of care, but it will also lead to overtreatment and overdiagnosis, because as we know from the US, your job in the US, if you're a company, is to find the people that are willing to pay, or the insurance companies. And HCA, Hospital Corporation of America, which is over here, has been indicted for fraud, for giving people heart surgery that didn't need it in Florida, fined hundreds of millions of pounds. United Health, which is also Optum, which is here, Optum's management consultant, United Health, where Simon Stevens worked, has been fined hundreds of millions of dollars in the US for fraud, for both the denial of care and for overtreatment and for Medicare claim, for claiming from the government for treatments that they haven't given. There's a whole Department of Justice in the US that's set up to deal with that. I keep doing this, I don't learn. Oh, it's gone completely now. Yeah. So, from inclusion to selection. And I can't labour this enough, because what you're going to hear from Simon Stevens, what you're going to hear from the new directors of STPs who are being paid a lot of money, is that we're abandoning the internal market, we're getting rid of the purchaser-provider split. That may be so, but they're doing it within a market context. Because markets are all about integration, vertical integration and horizontal integration. They want to merge because monopoly is their natural tendency, the end of the market, really. And that's why there are only 5 big food companies, 5 drug companies, 5 management, the big 5. So it's really important that when you think about this word integration, what the government's really talking about is the integration of providers, not area-based health systems. So under the old system, we had integrated health systems, where the whole area was the people in charge of the area health board or area health authority were responsible for providing and ensuring services for everybody in that area, and they directly manage those services. In the new system of STPs, what they mean is provider integration, but unfortunately there is no duty to provide services for everybody living in that area anymore. So what the government is doing is it's trying to move us towards insurance pools and away from area-based populations. And it's done that by making every single one of us members of our CCG by virtue of belonging to the GP practice. So we're not automatically covered if we live in Newcastle. I'm not anymore, because my GP is in London, or perhaps, is somewhere else. And so therefore, I won't be automatically covered by the CCG, Secondary Emergency Care. So I will then have to go to wherever it is that my GP is, which may not fall into the CCG area. And so in that way, the government is moving to creating these pools. And I use this because it's difficult to explain. But in the old days, we had contiguous areas. Everybody was covered. And that's that word, contiguous. Nobody was being left out. A very important word. Universal healthcare meant you had to have contiguous areas, and the area health boards or area health authorities or primary care trusts were responsible for everybody in that area and for those services. Now you've got that completely dissolved, and GP practice boundaries have gone. And now you've got these CCGs where people become members, but I can become a member from the north into a London-based one because practice boundaries have gone completely. So you may not get access to your local CCGs. So what this Act is trying to do, and it's been a bit thwarted by these general election results, because the Local Government Finance Act fell, and STPs are non-statutory. They're not legal bodies, they're not legal forms, they've got no legal authority whatsoever. And the government was hoping to pass some primary legislation so that it could really get them going. So that's why I think they're still challenging them. But insurance-based pools are membership-based organisations, they're not geographic. And so all people living in the area aren't naturally covered, and people may be excluded. So you can begin to see how this whole system is moving towards what was called the Health Maintenance Organisation, or ACO. The Accountable Care Organisation is membership-based. So I'll just go through this quickly. So I'm just aware of time. Sorry, I'm just going to come back to the problems of the market. So I think we've got to remember that markets operate on the basis of risk selection, and it's the providers that choose, not the patients. Don't think that you really get any choice. And the administration costs are very, very high, and especially now that we're bringing in Bupa, Hospital Corporation of America, United, Netcare, all of these big companies are coming in. And you've got their profits and their shareholders. That's the primary purpose. The primary duty is to shareholders, not to the NHS or patients. You've got the costs of marketing, the legal costs, and all these other costs. And this is oh God, I keep doing this. It's amazing. Yeah. So I thought I would show you this one. This is from the US, which shows you how less than 64% of the budget is going on medical care. This is the US, this is Steffi Woolhandler and David Himmelstein's work. And then you've got this Institute of Medicine report. So the US is the most expensive system in the world. It's running at nearly $3 trillion. And yet almost $1.790 billion is wasted. Now that is the Institute of Medicine, which is a very august body. It's one of the most august, prestigious bodies in the US. And these are the data that they put together. So this is the warning, and yet we have the American healthcare model is being imported by zealots who really believe in the marketplace. So I thought I'd show you some slides about what had been happening to beds and to the rise of the private sector, which goes back to the 1990s. And it goes back to the transfer of long-term care of older people, mental health, learning disabilities, out of the NHS into local authorities. And what you can see on that top line, I don't know if you can all see it, but that's the rise of the private sector beds. So there were less than 100,000 and they've gone up to 450,000 privately owned beds, owned by, in the main, by 5 or 6 very large multinational global corporations. And then now you can see what's been happening to NHS beds. And interestingly enough, you went back to 1948. There were 450,000 beds in 1948 in the NHS. I haven't gone back that far, but by 1972, there were roughly about half of that, 225,000. But you can see how the NHS beds are almost disappearing. And this is for a country where the population has almost doubled. We've got ageing population, and yet we've got hardly any beds, almost the lowest beds in Europe. So you can see how catastrophic the decrease has been. And that's been driven in large part by PFI, massive cuts and closures. And it's just a simple myth that we don't need hospital beds anymore. What we do need, of course, is the community services. So many of the services that were in small cottage hospitals, small intermediate care beds, all of those services have been completely cut and decimated. And mental health is about the worst. For people every week are having to travel 500 miles or more to get a mental health bed. Last week I had a tweet from a friend who's a psychiatrist saying there is not a single bed in my area in Birmingham, and another one from London. This is a disgrace. So you can see what's been happening, this enormous decrease, the NHS bars going down, down, down. But that solid line in the middle, can you see the solid line? That was the local government provided beds. So the local government also had a lot of residential care beds, and they had a duty to arrange, their duties were changed, and they began to dispose and privatise under enormous pressure from the government to sell off their buildings. They were financially incentivised to do so that now there are almost no public provision whatsoever. So we've got a huge transfer. And unless you see the big picture, you don't see what's been lost. And I think this is a really important picture. This is the whole picture, the whole system approach of the way in which NHS beds and services are being transferred to local authority and then in turn to private for-profit corporations. And now the NHS is renting back beds from the private for-profit sector at £1,000 a night, £2,000 a night. Quite extraordinary. This is what's been happening to local authority-supported adults in residential care. And you can see the red is the enormous expansion this time in homes, the number of residential homes. This is not beds, this is homes, and the way in which local authority homes have almost completely disappeared. And the same thing's happened for Meals and Wheels, for all the home help services. Once all these home helps and Meals and Wheels services, the staff were employed on decent terms and conditions, not high pay, but good holidays, sick pay, etc. They've now been completely transferred. Instead of being 90-95% provided by the local authorities, they've all been outsourced to companies, mum and papa companies, but also big companies like Virgin, etc. And now Virgin, of course, has got increasing numbers of contracts for some of the most vulnerable people. People with learning disabilities, people, adolescents with mental health problems, in Surrey, in Sussex, all over the country. They are getting, never fly Virgin. That's all I can say. This is what's been happening here. So we've seen the great disposal. And again, you can see what's been happening to expenditure. But I think this is the important story, is that part of the real pressure is the enormous decrease in local authority expenditure that's taken place over time. So older people, adults with physical learning disabilities, adults with learning disabilities looks blue, it looks like it's increased, but that's because of a transfer of funds from the NHS and responsibilities, funding and responsibilities. adults with mental health needs, other adults. So it's a pretty depressing scenario as to what's been happening. And here again, is it a small wonder that people can't be discharged? They're actually being discharged almost to very unsuitable conditions and premises, because what we've seen is not just mass privatisation of services, but now more and more people, only the very vulnerable, are now receiving services at all. So whereas 10 years ago, people with moderate needs were receiving services, they're no longer receiving services at all. So the story is not a very happy one, and what I haven't had time to go into is the big multinational corporations that are coming in. And that's what I really mean. So it's all very well the government talking about lifting the public sector pay, but not only is it about more money, but the problem is that many staff now are being transferred out. So it's not just under PFI, catering and cleaning and portering, it's actually mental health nurses, disability, OTs, physios. Physios have virtually disappeared. They're setting up as private companies. Midwives, they're all being transferred out. So not only are they not being counted as staff, and I just heard today that the 18 big corporations struck a deal that we will not get access to their staffing data, and the standard contract has been watered down. So those staff will not only be counted, we won't even know about quality of care, we can't do the monitoring, but also what good is lifting the public sector pay cap if they're no longer employed by the public sector? So I haven't had time to go into the corporations, but I've been trying to give you sort of quick history, a quick overview of where this is going, and why STPs, though they're presented as a very positive thing that we have to get on board with, I think the important thing to remember is they have no legal or statutory basis. They are predicated upon £26 billion worth of cuts, major closures, and major shifts of health services away from the centre to local government. And of course the other thing that I haven't had time to go into is local government funding. The government, as you know, local government used to receive more than 80% of its funding from central grant. That was redistribution. So the money was collected in and paid to local government. Then the government moved that to the revenue support grant. But its plan is to phase out the revenue support grant completely by 2019, along with the public health budget and along with the Better Care Fund. So here are the grants, and this is the House of Commons briefing on what's happening. The revenue support grant, the government wants to phase out. The public health grant, $3 billion. The Improved Better Care Fund. There are a number of grants that the government wants to phase out completely. And this is how important it is. You can begin to see the revenue support grant is going to be chopped from 11.5 to 5.4 billion. They want to raise more and more business rates to keep the spending the same. But the problem with business rates is it's all very well if you're living in a rich area, but poor areas like the northeast, you will know particularly areas where the business rate is just going to be completely regressive. So you can begin to see that local authorities will be selling, disposing, getting rid of what they can, and then finally they say, well, we can't manage anymore. We're going to have to change our entitlement criteria. We're going to bring in entitlements. So you're not going to have universal entitlement, you're going to have an eligibility. And we're going to ask the government to allow us to use the secondary regulations to bring in charging, because they're the new powers that the local government has been given. So you can begin to see this huge vicious circle. And this is why it's very interesting, the STPs, because you've got STPs and you've also got big things like devolution going on. but they're all both about devolving, denationalising, devolving, and making the rump health service the responsibility of local government, and those who can afford to pay will end up going privately. And that's the government's vision, it's its view. That's what the US healthcare system is predicated on. It's got Medicare for the very old, it's got Medicaid at state level, with varying eligibility and entitlements for the very poor, and the vast majority, 60 or 70 million people with no health insurance at all, are the working poor. And you've got enormous variation in entitlement. Now, you can say, well, it's always been a bit of a lottery in the NHS, but we've always strived to have a national health service. Now, we've just got dismantling and disruption and privatisation. So I'm afraid I don't have good news, apart from the fact that the local government finance bill fell just before the election. And that finance bill was predicated upon these huge cuts and giving the powers to switch everything over. So I think maybe we're in this very interesting period of uncertainty. So you can begin to see how the government has planned, and this has happened, that the centrally distributed income is falling dramatically from 85%, which is the most progressive way of distributing it. You know, you raise at the centre, that's your risk pooling model, and you distribute to the areas that most need it. You do not raise locally, that's more regressive, and charges are the most regressive of all. And of course now we've got the government not saying it's unaffordable, it's unsustainable, but of course it's neither of these things. There is no demographic time bomb. All of this is deeply political, and it's about the decisions that government choose to take. And I think that's really important to hang on to that. And I think that's why it's very important that we continue to actually get the message out. The NHS is the thing that's dearest to everybody. It's, as people say, it's the nearest thing that the British have to religion, the NHS. And the Treasury, back in the 1950s, was overwhelmed by the fact that of all their institutions that they put in place, education, pensions, everything, the NHS was the most important. And I think that came out again today. We've got an enormous battle on our hands because I'm very much afraid that the politicians of all parties are kicking this into the long grass with talks of public sector pay, lifting the cap, and they're not addressing the fundamental issues. And it's not just about more money, it's about actually reinstating our NHS. So I'm going to end with the bill. This is a very important bill website. It's not great because we're a bit under-resourced in terms of time to do this, but the bill, we will try and get it back into Parliament. Please do look at it. We've got lots of briefings on it. And we've also got the list of around, I think it's around 38 MPs now, Labour MPs, but we had all the SNP as well, who support the bill. And so I think the most important thing is to put pressure, and I think the North East is great, because I think many of the Labour MPs have come out in support of the bill. So that's very important. And it's your campaign, it's the thing that's to give everybody hope. It makes everything possible. The second is to keep our NHS public, and we've got the local website, and this is the national one, which has a lot of information on it. And I've also given you the BMA summary of SCPs, which you may have seen, but also John Lister and Sean Boyle have an excellent report. And there will be lots of links on that website too. I'm going to take questions because I realise I've probably gone on longer than you wanted me to go on. And I realise that I haven't... Oh, Project Phoenix. I should have mentioned this. So, we had PFI, the Private Finance Initiative, in the 1990s and noughties, and you know what a disaster that was. The government is now planning a return to PFI. And it's doing that through something called Project Phoenix, where I think it's setting up 6 regional public-private partnerships, they've been called. And that is accompanied by the Naylor report. Robert Naylor was the chief exec at UCLH. He loved playing Monopoly. And he was put in charge of estate strategy. He once told me he'd never lost a game of Monopoly, so he was put in charge of estate strategy. And that report's key because it's about disposals, and we've seen mass disposals. And what the government wants to do is use more debt finance, where the land and buildings will be sold off again to help the public the public expenditure, and instead we'll be getting into more and more onerous, usurious sale and leaseback arrangements. So that's the PFI one. I think I've probably sort of addressed the others, but if not, you can come back, because I think some of them were more rhetorical. And the power, by the way, sits with the corporations now. Yeah. Or increasingly. Okay, thank you. I'll take some questions now if you like more questions.
Anybody like to get the ball rolling?
2015, Oxford put out a report that said there was 30,000 excess deaths in the country due to changes in the social care in the NHS. Now, just like Grenfell, which, I saw people normally go 90 plus deaths if they go in the army, but this seemed to just pass by without much comment. Should we not be making more of the first time since the Second World War that the trend in deaths has gone up?
Yeah, it was slightly disputed by academics. This is Martin McKee's paper, and it has been slightly disputed because of flu. So I'm not quite sure, and I haven't looked at that paper in detail myself. But of course, if we've got excess deaths, then we should be looking to understand the causes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You talked about the importance of having cross-party support for the reinstatement bill. You talked about the Greens, the SNP, the Lib Dems. But I was wondering about any Conservatives and the likes of Sarah Wasden and various others. There's a nurse actually, it's somewhat surprising. But I just wondered if you could comment on that, and also it does seem that this is an absolutely fundamental thing to get behind, and it seems rather a shame that there's only 30 Labour MPs inducted to that.
Yeah, we're very disappointed because in fact the NHS Bill is now a Labour Party policy as of last summer, but it's not in the manifesto, and we emailed Diane Abbott, who was then the Shadow Health Secretary, and she said as far as she's concerned it's still Labour Party policy. So I think it's some indication. Well, John Ashworth will not ever mention the bill, and he thinks that Simon Stevens' plan is great, I believe. So I think pressure needs to be put on the Labour Party, every opportunity really, because Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were early sponsors of the bill with Caroline. They were co-signatories of the bill. I think in the days when Jeremy and John thought there was never any chance of them ever. So that's one thing. And the other thing we're trying to do is establish an all-party parliamentary group. And we have got one or two Conservatives who we think would be interested there. I don't know that any of them would come out openly against their government. But anybody, please do keep trying. Because people like Sarah Williston, her heart is in the right place, but she can't quite bring herself to see it.
I think you've probably answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll ask it, and if I may, I'll come on to another point after. It was about the huge amounts of money that are wasted on PFI agreements and private purchase of provider spec and so on, and whether if all that money was used to fund an NHS remodelled along the lines of the reinstatement bill, would that be adequate, or would there still be a need for further funding through fair taxation? I think you've answered that one. I get the impression from all the figures you've given that there'd be more than enough.
You could do a lot. There's always a need for more, but you could do a lot, of course.
So really, if I could put a further point, I mentioned Keeper NHS Public Durham earlier. We've actually taken up the issue with the local council and written to every single councillor, so of all parties and none. Basically, the main point of our letter was that the general election results in County Durham, where every Labour MP was re-elected, mean there is no mandate for STPs, because within the Labour manifesto they talked about halting and reviewing STPs. And in fact, even the Tory manifesto said that while they supported STPs, they also should be brought in where they are locally supported. So our argument was the general election results show there is no mandate and there isn't local support. And it's a much wider public consultation than any of their silly engagement events and so on, which have involved infinitesimal numbers of the population. And we really, it really feels like you're banging your head against a brick wall when it comes to particularly Durham is still controlled by Labour, and it feels like you're banging your head against a brick wall and they're swallowing line and sinker what is being said to them by the bureaucrats of one sort or another. Do you have any?
Well, you have to
that?
keep giving them the analysis and talking to them. I mean, the Conservatives did have getting rid of, changing the internal, I can't remember the wording, but the internal market in their manifesto. And there's no doubt there's a need for regional planning tiers, because we've lost all the planning structures. But the problem is that the public health functions have been put into local authority and they've been decimated. And all the information has gone out to these CSUs, these clinical support units, and some of them privatised. So there is no planning. And if you look at the STPs, the paper by Sean Poyle is very good because nobody's doing any needs assessment or service planning. So if they were really what they said on the tin, then you would expect to see very good, detailed service planning going on. So I think you've got to take them on their own terms. If it's about integration of health and social care, how are they going to resolve the funding issue? If it's about planning, show us the plans and how they're doing it. Show us the assumptions and the estimates, because even PFI, you can look on my website, there's probably about 30 reports that I've written on PFI. You can see, and on the BMJ, you can see the way in which we took apart the planning assumptions. And there's a good paper we did on the Lewisham latest judicial review PFI, which looks at do they do any of the planning. So I think you should take them on in a measured way on the basis of the evidence in the reports. I think that's really, really important. I'm sure you're doing it already.
Keep going.
Yeah, and threaten not to go out and campaign for Labour. Turn it to Green. Yeah. Or Lib Dem or whatever,
Any party.
Any party.
On purpose.
Hi. Thank you. That was fascinating. I think one of the things that you demonstrated really clearly was the incremental nature and also the huge complexity. And I think that's the issue. So the bottom line is that everybody goes to their GP and everybody goes to the hospital and they get treatment, and we've yet been asked to take our checkbook out. Okay, so and we're also, the rhetoric around this is also that the actual increasing cost of the health service is because we have an ageing population and we have a demographic time bomb, and we have to ration because how will we ever afford the fact that you can't go on treating people forever? So that's the common health.
You should be a Tory politician, actually.
But that's what we're all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everybody sat here, understands and is passionate about this and understands some of that complexity. Yes. How do we change this for the general public? You said yourself that this is a religion. It's the nearest thing we have to a religion. But I've yet to really see the general population who are they subscribe to this religion, but they don't know it's been privatised. Well, that's the whole. Yeah. Sorry, that's they don't know it's been privatised. Sorry, that's my entire point. Yeah. How do we change that?
Tell them that don't believe you. I mean, it's just the NHS rule.
Yeah.
They assume it's just.
You're absolutely right, because the government's, you're quite right actually, that the government's been really, really clever. It wasn't in the Conservative Party manifesto, dismantling and abolishing the Health and Social Care Act. It's all been heavily concealed and disguised, and the public's confused. They don't even know what CCG is. I mean, how many of you all know? But that's why the local campaigns on the ground, I think what you're doing when you have your stalls and informing. And we've also tried some myths, the mythbuster sheets, like the ageing population, young sustainability. But, I get exhausted because I sit in the BMA practically in rage, and every distinguished doctor standing up and going, "Oh, we're unsustainable, wonderful,"
Well, actually, it was very similar to what Alison said. I think what you've summed up in that is, there's many of us here that worked all our lives in the NHS, and we've seen it, and that's put it into, real, like it's really explained it, although I think we all, we know it every day. But I think what you just said, Alison, is really important, is that the campaign on the ground are really, really important, because when things are happening in the local area, that's when people do see what's happening. And we're campaigning in South Tyneside because they're using that as a model for the rest of the region in basically trying to close the hospital. And it's there, when things are happening, you can get out and explain to people, and I think that's the positive end.
When people know what they're losing.
When people know what they're losing, and it's really important to explain that is part of all the things that you said today.
I was going to say, you're the academic, and I don't feel you answered the question this gentleman over here is asking, but I'm at the coalface. I feel that it's just common sense that you can't save £27 billion in 4 years and put public health first and cure people so they don't go to hospital. It hasn't happened. Richard Dole published his information on smoking in 1958. Still 16% of women who are pregnant are smoking in the RVI, in the hospital here. And the government, it's a lot more than just repeating the rhetoric. It is actually what they're doing to the people who are working in health service. We're so exhausted with actually trying to, today I've had to apply for continuing healthcare funding as an emergency to get someone 24-hour nursing care. I'm a GP. Last week I had to get a taxi to send a patient with appendicitis to a hospital, but I have to be careful what I say, because these are all confidential pieces of information that somebody might put together who it was. So, and then GPs being told, oh, you can't be political. And the last thing I'd like to say is actually, why aren't we saying about conflict of interest? We've got Andrew Lansley's wife is actually in a private health company. We've got Theresa May's husband works for a hedge fund. We've got Jeremy Hunt who's getting big donations from private health companies. They seem to get away with so much, but we have to tell people that's what it's about. It's about profit.
So can I just stop you for a minute, because I think you're absolutely right, but GPs are making a mistake. You of all groups can be political, and I saw the Save Our Surgeries campaign in the East End, which was brilliant. They had the mosques out, they had everybody out campaigning about what was going on and informing. And GPs as independent contractors can still do an awful lot. And I think one of the great regrets is that GPs haven't used their surgeries more to inform patients. They can do it much more than hospital doctors can.
We can be stopped by the Royal College not to scare people.
Well, I think you should talk to Claire Dorado about it then. I'm sure she can give you, and Margaret McCartney. They're on the council of the Royal College. I'm sure they would support you. I think you've got to do what you think is right. And there's enough information. If you put out Keep Our NHS public leaflets, we put them in around the Institute, don't we, actually? So I didn't answer somebody's question though, you said. Whose question is it?
He was asking, as a member of the public, about how we're going to argue against it because they put this case for STPs. And I think basically the bottom line is you can't do it. You're not going to stop people getting admitted to hospital in 4 years. So you can't, the health service isn't at a point where you can say with these huge numbers of billions by keeping people out of hospital. That's got to be the argument.
The couching the changes as improvements in the centres of excellence, where you need a certain throughput of patients to keep that centre of excellence up to standard, and the specialists there trained and have enough experience to carry on. Now, we can't really argue against that.
A good example is the stroke service. So it was shut in Gateshead because of lack of a CT scanner, and it was moved to Newcastle. And guess what? We all said, the GP said, people are going to die or they're going to be made worse because they'll be in an ambulance on the bridge in a traffic jam. And guess what happened? They couldn't, the RVI couldn't deal with the number of cases. And that's what happened. And this is what they're saying. They argue, the consultant in Gateshead is saying, oh, we have to do it. I've been appointed to modernise. We can't look after stroke patients in Gateshead. They've all got to go to the RVI. But they didn't actually look at the service. They didn't look at how many beds you need for Hexham and Gateshead stroke patients.
They've done the same in South Tyneside as they did in Gateshead, and the same thing's happening. But what we said is that the hospitals could collaborate and keep both units open, because they're saying they can't get the consultants, but they could actually cover, they can cover both hospitals if they work as a team.
This is where we need academics, because they've paid the RVI £1 million to take the paediatric service. They've paid them over £1 million to do the stroke service, and then Gateshead's taken it back. And it was on the basis of a CT scanner. How much does a CT scan cost? It doesn't cost £1 million.
They're sending people back. They're discriminating against the elderly people with learning difficulties because they're saying just send them back to the QE, where they haven't now got the facilities to administer an acute stroke service.
That centralisation of Scotland hospitals.
You've been talking about local issues. Can I take you back to American corporations? One of the institutions in the world which has taken on American corporations has been the European Community. What I've been wondering is whether by leaving Europe we are losing one of the protections against the American corporations taking over British healthcare.
Well, in 2000 we wrote a paper in the Lancet on GATS, General Agreement Trading Services, where we showed that the UK government hadn't actually protected the hospital sector in the event of privatisation. So I think the problem is it goes back to the GATS agreement. So I don't think
it doesn't matter whether we're in Europe or
no, and we'll enter into new trade agreements within, and it's the investor-state disputes panels that we're really worried, where the investors can take governments to court. That's the really worrying thing that we're going to you will likely see. And that shows you the power of the corporate, how it's growing and growing and growing over the last few decades. Sorry, you had a question, and then,
So, there's so many layers to this, but as a GP, one of the things is, I think probably we should have been salaried. I think one of the problems is that we're private. And although that makes us able to campaign more, I'm increasingly clear that it's a problem. So that's one sort of observation. But I'm muddled in my own head about ACOs. Because for the first time in however many years it is, we have an opportunity to get rid of payment by results and actually to align hospital and primary care with the same incentives to share a single budget. And that's very attractive to me. We've spent years watching increased activity in hospitals, unnecessary increased activity, not on the scale that you show in the States, but certainly unnecessary. And aligning the incentives in the same direction in primary and secondary care would be really attractive. But I'm worried that you're going to tell me that I should have nothing to do with ACOs and nothing to do with taking my locality or group of practices into a partnership. But I'm muddled because payment by results has been the most terrible thing in the market. And this does seem to be a move away from the market, and I'm just being
So the government is not moving away from the market, it's integrating market structures. And that's what you have, you know, when GSK, you know, when you get vertical integration, the wholesalers, the retailers integrating primary, secondary care, integrating them to make them much more powerful provider-based organisations. By all means, and that's what they meant about getting rid of payment by results. By all means, get rid of that, but put in the legislative framework that allows you to have a national health service and universal provision. Until that's done, all you've got is market integration as opposed to public service integration, where you know your integration would be at the level of a whole area, an area-based community. Does that?
So that means, so essentially you're saying that they're not mutually exclusive. If we get the legislative framework around it right, then you could have collaborative and cooperative practice in.
Absolutely, collaborative practice was brought about by privatisation.
Well, by the process of provider split. Yeah.
And it's when the hospital started costing more
services. But actually moving to block contracts and moving to sharing the money with my local hospital is potentially, to me, attractive. It's not attractive to most GPs, I have to say, but it is.
Well, but also general practice funding has been decimated. Yeah. You've really lost such a big share of it that you shouldn't be grasping at straws. You should be saying, and I think I'm sympathetic to the idea of the integration. I do think the separation's been a bad thing, and I think a public salary service would have been a good thing for GPs personally. But as you know, more and more GPs are now being employed by commercial companies.
Yeah. We'll take 2 more questions, but we can carry that conversation because we are being sweethearted at the minute by people who want to see ACOs going to ACTs, and this week's was Accountable Care Associations. It's like, stop changing the name. We know what you're talking about. Tim and then
There's been a very useful analysis and history. What I want to say with is a rather less technical point. We do need to continue to try and get the information out to people, whether it's through practices or writing to MPs, and I think there'll be a lot hangs on what happens to do with the monopolies, the mergers, or to do with Sky in the next few days. But when it comes to having the North East, and Tony Blair helped us is on its way, but he did work in marginal seats, in particular on the swing voters. We don't have enough marginal seats in the North East. So one of the issues we have is how to persuade people where they actually have a bit more leverage over their MPs. If anyone's got a solution to that, it would be great. But that's one of the difficulties we've got here.
I don't have the answers necessarily, but I think there's a good. I mean, a lot of the Labour MPs have supported the bill. You can look at the lists on our website, and it's the ones that haven't somehow. And to get
It's all those ones that changed surprisingly a few weeks ago, and the ones that didn't change.
No, they're fickle. Politicians are fickle.
But we certainly had a lot of local Labour MPs who were out on our last march who wanted to be photographed with Keep Our NHS Public banner, and most of whom hadn't been around. I have to say, it was an amazing array of people. So I think there is something about that actually we're beginning to matter much more today than previously.
I was going to mention a point that I heard on the consumer programme, you and yours. They had the care home company, Full Season, I think it was, talking about what they want to do. Now, Four Seasons was involved in a vanguard in our area where the NHS put money into the care to improve services. But what this CEO of the care homes was saying, that they want bigger, longer-term contracts to make it worth their while training the staff so that they can offer other services and have community hubs in their care home. So that's what it's going to be. You're going to have the private sector getting the integrated services and then sucking the funds out and it going 12% because it's privatised, the shareholders get. So that, that might be a reason against it.
Anything more you want to say, Alison?
No, just I think the solutions are in our hands really, and just to say thank you very much for being such a great audience and such good and important interactive questions, but I think it doesn't stop here.
Doesn't it? Which is what we'll talk about in a minute. I just thought people might want to let them know who won the ballot in terms of Labour MPs, because actually the top four for private members' bills are all Labour, unfortunately not round here. So Chris White, Labour Rhondda, Steve Reid, Labour Croydon North, Afzal Khan, Labour Manchester Gorton, and Karen Buck, Labour Westminster North. So if we could really push those Labour MPs to actually pick up and run with the NHS reinstatement bill, that would be so powerful. Unfortunately, none of our local. That's what I was just checking to see if there's anything there. So we're going to bring this evening to a close, but also remind you that this is one in a series of the many events that are going around. And I'm mortified that I forgot to talk about Keeper NHS Public Durham, one of our most active groups.
Remember the gala on Saturday?
You beat me to it. We've got celebrations for the NHS birthday on Wednesday. And it's a special birthday, because I want to mention that Alex Myers, who has the same birthday, but not, I don't think, the same age. She's worked in the NHS and the public sector for the whole of her career, like many people. She's been very active in the health unions, but now she's retired, is spending lots of her time campaigning with Save South Tyneside Hospital campaign and Keep Our NHS Public Health. So happy birthday to the NHS and happy birthday to Alex on Wednesday. We will have a birthday cake at the monument, a very large birthday cake, from 12 till 2. We will have an enormous card, which is actually part of a national campaign that we will be asking people to sign. We will then take that up to the RVI by 2:30, and we're trying to get union involvement to sign that card. And then we'll be posting it off for certain Jeremy Hunt, who I think will be getting many of these. So if you're interested, then please come along and support that. The Mimes Gala is on Saturday. And not only is the Keeper NHS Public Durham got a stall, but a marching this year, is that right?
So, of the march, yeah. Which
I think is just fantastic. What time do we need to meet and where? I just remember it being very early.
I can't remember.
It's 7:45.
7:45 at the Red Hills, the Miners Hall.
The information is on all of our websites. So just at the end to say thank you to Andy Parks, who's been videoing this event, to Simon Brooks, who's been the venue manager, and who gave us that little bit of history at the beginning. We are taking a leave-in collection, so we'd be grateful for your contributions. What we'd be even more grateful for is if you could start to set up regular direct debits to fund Keep Our NHS Public. All of the campaigns, locally and nationally, are run on people's individual contributions, and it would be really helpful if you could do that. All the details are on the website and on the leaflets that you've got. We are going for a drink at the Union Rooms next door, and you'll all be very welcome. But lastly, and John Wally, you never put his name on here. Thank you so much, John, for all the organising you do. But finally, to Professor Allyson Pollock for giving such a clear explanation of what's happened. It's really important that we don't just think it's people like Alison who should be talking about those things. We need to talk to our colleagues, to our neighbours, to our friends, to our fellow trade unionists, to keep explaining, because they want us to give up. They're really trying to just flatten us. And I know for most of us, particularly working in service, it is exhausting, but it's really important we keep fighting, because if we don't, that's when they win and that's when the NHS will disappear. So, thank you.